As the Soviet-Afghan War roared, Russian soldiers grew desperately tired of the old yet sacred AKM, and in its place, the AK-74 arrived. It completely changed the assault rifle game, and even in Ukraine today, you will see Americans ditching their modern M4s for it. It was infamous in Call of Duty Black Ops, and can be seen in its shortened AK-74U version in multiple James Bond movies. But what most people aren't aware of is the convoluted and quite dark journey of the AK-74, from the deserts of Afghanistan in the 1970s to its eerie presence during the Bosnian genocide, and even its use with modern-day troops all across the globe. So let's get into it. This is going to be a disturbing story though, so now you're warned. You see, by the 1960s, the Soviets already had a rifle they trusted with their lives, and that rifle was the famous AKM. It fired the chunky 7.62 by 39 round, and could shrug off dust and grime, allowing it to fire constantly or finer weapons jammed. But then the Americans turned up in Vietnam carrying something completely different. The M16. It was light, it barely kicked, and it threw a tiny 5.56 bullet so fast that one soldier could carry nearly double the ammunition of his Soviet counterpart. On the North Vietnamese side, the real trouble with the AKM was the recoil. That fat 7.62 round destroyed your shoulder after a while, and on full auto, the muzzle climbed vertically like it was trying to shoot down birds, so a panicked conscript would empty a magazine hitting absolutely nothing. Soviet analysts pored over what that little M16 was doing in the jungle, and they did not enjoy the feeling of being second. So in the late 1960s, the Kremlin slowly ordered up a competition to build a lighter round that could match the American one, and it was Kalashnikov's team that came out on top. And what they came up with would soon earn a chilling nickname in the mountains of Afghanistan. The new cartridge was the 5.45 by 39, and it was a strange little thing. It was skinny, light, and it left the barrel at nearly 900 meters a second, far quicker than the round it replaced. Inside the tip, the designers left a hollow air pocket, and that tiny empty space did something genuinely disturbing. When the bullet punched into flesh, the soft nose crumpled, and the round began to tumble end over end, tearing a wound far wider than its skinny size ever suggested. Kalashnikov bolted this round onto a refined AKM body and capped it with a newer muzzle brake, that big slotted can on the end that vents gas sideways and down. The brake did its job beautifully, because now the rifle barely twitched, even when you held the trigger flat down. An inexperienced insurgent could lean into it and walk a burst straight onto a target, where before he would have been wrestling the gun the whole time while trying to keep the rounds on target. And because the ammunition was so light, a soldier could haul roughly double the rounds for the same weight on his back. On top of that soft recoil, the lighter, flatter bullet was simply easier to hit with at range, so a raw recruit landed far more of his shots. They badged it the AK-74, and the Soviet Army adopted it in 1974. They built a squad machine gun cousin too, the RPK-74, feeding the very same round from a longer barrel and a bigger magazine. For 5 years, the rifle mostly sat in arsenals, a quiet upgrade nobody outside the Eastern Bloc had really taken their eyes on. Then, in December 1979, Soviet tanks rolled south into Afghanistan, and the AK-74 finally got its first test. And this was where the rifle stopped being a paper design and turned into a killer. Soviet paratroopers and motor rifle troops flooded into Afghanistan with the AK-74 slung over their shoulders, and it was the first time the wider world got a proper look at it. The Mujahideen, the Afghan fighters dug into those brown broken hills, soon started noticing something grim about the men it struck. The wounds it left were horrific, far worse than anything the old 7.62 had ever managed. A round that went in clean would tumble inside the body and come out the size of a fist, and fighters hit in a limb often bled out before anyone could reach them. They knew exactly what those wounds looked like, but this was something else entirely. So they handed the 5.45 a name that stuck for good, the poison bullet, convinced the Soviets had laced the rounds with something. They hadn't, of course. But the real explanation was almost stranger than poison. It was pure physics, the skinny bullet doing exactly what its designers had drawn up. Western doctors who later treated those wounds were stunned, and the round's ghastly effect fed years of argument about whether it should even be a legal weapon of war. For the ordinary Soviet conscript, though, Afghanistan was less about wonder rounds and more about just staying alive on the roads. The Mujahideen loved to ambush Soviet supply columns from the high ground, dropping the lead truck and then hosing the trapped vehicles stacked up below it. And when that happened, a soldier bailing out into a wall of fire needed a rifle he could actually control, not one firing all over the place. That is where the AK-74 paid for itself, letting a frightened man put rounds where he wanted them, while the RPK-74 gunner laid down longer bursts to cover the scramble. But the new round was not all good news, and the Soviets learned its weakness fast. That light, skinny bullet was brutal against a man, yet it struggled to punch through a thick mud brick wall the way the heavier 7.62 used to. And Afghanistan is a land of those compounds, so for prying an enemy out of cover, the old round was sometimes still the better tool. For close, dirty work in trenches, alleys, and bunkers, the Soviets also fielded a chopped-down version called the AK-74U. It had a stubby little barrel, a side-folding stock, and it was compact enough to swing around inside a vehicle or a doorway without snagging. Tank crews loved it, helicopter pilots adored it, and the Spetsnaz, the Soviet special forces, carried it on their night raids, loved it not so much. The Afghans nicknamed it the Krinkov, and the story goes the name came off a captured Soviet officer, though nobody has ever actually pinned the man down. Whatever you called it, it quickly became a status symbol, the gun you carried to show everyone you were somebody. But the prize every enemy fighter and every spy really wanted was a whole intact AK-74 to smuggle out of the country. The CIA was pumping weapons and cash to the Mujahideen, and they were desperate to get their hands on the new Soviet rifle and pull it apart. The head of Pakistan's intelligence service later claimed the Americans paid $5,000 for the very first AK-74 the Afghans managed to capture. $5,000 for a single rifle, just to lay it out on a workbench and learn its secrets. By the time the Soviets limped out of Afghanistan in 1989, beaten and worn down, the AK-74 had already earned its grim reputation in blood. And the next place it surfaced was far closer to the heart of Europe, in a war that is still remembered today as one of the darkest periods of European history since World War II. When Yugoslavia tore itself to pieces in the early 1990s, every faction grabbed whatever was in the armories, and those armories were absolutely filled to the brim. Yugoslavia had armed itself for a war against the whole world, with millions of rifles squirreled away, and when the country imploded, those guns flooded straight into the hands of neighbors turning on neighbors. The standard rifle of the old Yugoslav army was the Zastava M70, a homegrown Kalashnikov copy in the familiar 7.62, and that gun was simply everywhere. But the AK-74 was scattered through the mix as well, traded and smuggled in alongside everything else. And the men carrying these Kalashnikovs included the army of Republika Srpska, the Bosnian Serbs. Those are the very same forces whose name is now welded to the worst massacre Europe has seen since the Second World War. In July 1995, Bosnian Serb troops overran the town of Srebrenica, a place the United Nations had actually declared a protected safe zone. What followed over the next few days was cold, organized slaughter. More than 8,000 Bosniak men and boys were torn from their families, marched off and executed, then bulldozed into mass graves. It is the one event on European soil since 1945 that international courts have formally ruled to be a genocide, and the rifles slung over the shoulders of the men who did it were Kalashnikovs, mostly the old M70, with the AK-74 somewhere in that grim crowd. There is nothing heroic about the gun's part in this, and I am not going to dress it up as if there were. It was a tool, and in Bosnia, it sat in the hands of men doing genuinely disturbing things. But this dark chapter also revealed something about the weapon that would shape the rest of its life. The AK-74 and its cousins had slipped the leash of any single army. Once a design like this leaks out of state arsenals, it spreads through smuggling routes and collapsing borders, and you simply cannot stuff that genie back into the bottle. Decades after the Balkan Wars burned out, those same kept resurfacing on Europe's black market, smuggled west into robberies and even terror attacks far from the hills they came from. And nowhere would that prove clearer than in the savage city fighting that erupted next, this time inside Russia itself. So in 1994, Russia turned its own creation against a breakaway republic down in its southern mountains, Chechnya, and the AK-74 ended up on both sides of the fight at once. The Russian army carried it as standard use, but so did the Chechen rebels, who had inherited mountains of Soviet kit when the Union fell apart, which meant Russia marched into a war against an enemy armed with Russia's own rifles. The fighting hinged on the capital, Grozny, and Grozny turned into a meat grinder almost at once. On New Year's Eve 1994, the Russians shoved armored columns straight into the city, badly trained, poorly led, and crammed with terrified young conscripts. The 131st Maycop Brigade rolled in around 1,000 strong and parked up near the central train station, expecting almost no resistance. Then the Chechens sprang the trap, knocking out the lead and rear vehicles, so the rest were boxed in, before raining fire down from every window and basement around them. Within roughly 3 days, the brigade had been shattered, with nearly 800 of its men killed, captured, or missing, and almost all of its tanks and carriers left burning in the streets. The survivors spilled out of their wrecked vehicles and fought on foot, and now it was rifle against rifle, room by room. For the young Russians, it was a nightmare, hunting an unseen enemy who knew every cellar and rooftop, where your rifle was often the only thing between you and a grenade tossed down a stairwell. And in that tight, vicious street brawl, the stubby AK-74U truly came into its own, short enough to whip around a corner before a full-length rifle could ever clear it. Both sides leaned on it hard, and by the end of that first battle, Grozny was a wasteland of rubble and burnt-out steel. Here, too, that skinny 5.45 showed its limits, often zipping clean through a thin wall without doing much, while a heavier round might have dropped the man hiding behind it. Russia eventually retreated the city back, but the humiliation was nowhere near finished. In 1996, the Chechens stormed back into Grozny in a stunning surprise raid and seized it all over again, forcing Moscow into a ceasefire that ended the First War in flat-out defeat. Then, in 1999, the Russians came back for round 2, and this time, they fought it completely differently. Instead of charging in blind, they ringed the city and hammered it flat with artillery and airstrikes before feeding infantry in behind the wreckage. It was slower, it was uglier, and in the end, it worked. Across both wars, the AK-74 was simply the go-to tool, the default solution to a conflict that killed tens of thousands. But then the war ended, and now, 30 years later, most would have expected the gun to be phased out, yet it is still seen as the go-to weapon for many professional soldiers across the globe. So here we are, half a century after the AK-74 first appeared, and the thing flatly refuses to retire. Russia kept improving it rather than throwing it out. In 1991, they rolled out the AK-74M, a modernized version with tough black polymer furniture and a stock that folds neatly to the side, and that became the Russian army's bread and butter for 30 years. By then, millions had been built, licensed churned out by friends like Bulgaria and East Germany, which is a big part of why the rifle is now scattered across roughly half the planet. The newest ones even wear rails for optics and night sights, bolted onto a rifle whose bones are pure Cold War. But the place you will see it in its rawest, ugliest form today is the war in Ukraine. When Russia invaded in February 2022, both armies were already carrying the same family of rifles, because both had grown straight out of the old Soviet machine. Russian troops, Ukrainian troops, the AK-74 is the standard weapon staring across no man's land in both directions. And when Russian soldiers were killed or overrun, their rifles became prized trophies, scooped up and turned straight back on their former owners. The Russians had tried to move on with the AK-12, a fresh 5.45 rifle adopted in 2018, but they never built enough to go round, so the old AK-74 carried the load anyway. And even that skinny new AK-12 still spits out the exact same 5.45 round. So in the ways that matter, the old design never really left. Ukraine, meanwhile, put out a call for foreign fighters, and more than 20,000 volunteers answered it from all over the world, plenty of them Americans. Most of those volunteers were not handed a shiny Western M4, they were handed an AK-74, because that is what Ukraine has stacked up by the crate load. There are American volunteers sat in Ukrainian trenches right now, men raised on the M16 and the AR-15, gripping a Cold War Soviet rifle their own fathers were trained to fear. And it stretches far beyond Ukraine. The AK-74 and its descendants are standard issue across the old Soviet world, from Belarus to Kazakhstan, and they have bled out into Syria, Iraq, and a string of African armies. The reason is the same one that made the gun so nasty in Afghanistan and Grozny. It is simple, it is cheap, it barely kicks, the ammunition is light, and it keeps running through dust and grit that would jam fussier weapons solid. You do not need to be a trained marksman to be deadly with one, and that is precisely the genius of the thing. The poison bullet that terrified Afghan fighters back in 1980 is still tumbling through bodies today. From a quiet upgrade nobody noticed, to the deserts of Afghanistan, to the mass graves of Bosnia, and the shattered streets of Grozny, the AK-74 has shadowed nearly every dirty war of the last half-century. And every time the shooting kicks off somewhere new, there is a fair chance that somewhere in the dust, somebody is still squeezing its trigger.